Good evening. Welcome to the Mudroom. Before we begin, I would like to introduce Sheryl, the Executive Director of AVA and a potential presidential candidate for the Democratic Party in the next presidential election, to say a few words.
I'm so happy to be in New Hampshire to announce my guest. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. Thank you all for coming to AVA Gallery and Art Center tonight for tonight's presentation with the theme of Wrong Turn. Most of you know that AVA provides art education, exhibitions for people of all ages, abilities, and incomes, as well as special events like tonight's event. It'll be 50 years in August since AVA had its first exhibition. To celebrate this anniversary, we've launched a capital campaign called From Seed to Bloom. So far, we've raised 54% of a $2.7 million goal. And so we have $1.2 million to go. I don't expect anyone in here to actually make that gift, but we do hope that you'll continue to attend our events and celebrate this 50th year with us and contribute to our efforts to make this place secure and endure in the future. The purpose of the campaign is to tend to our physical spaces. You can see that you're in a building that's 140 plus years old. Cultivating our financial sustainability, which any nonprofit in the Upper Valley or anywhere around in the land would say is always a struggle. And growing our people and programs so that we can serve more people, as well as nurturing our vitality. To learn more about all of this, feel free to talk to me or to Dave Eastman, who's over there, our development specialist, anytime. And there's literature on the table over in the corner, so feel free to take it home and read it at your leisure. As we celebrate our birthday throughout the year, we're going to have a lot of different events, and we hope that you'll participate and make it as celebratory as possible. We want to party with you. So thank you for your support by being here. I'd like to now reintroduce Mike Lovell. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Mike Lovell, and I am one of the members of the Mudroom Committee, and the other members are Sally Bacon, who's over here, Judith Herzog, who's sitting right over here, Lianne Moccia, who is going to be telling a story tonight, Sheryl Trainer, who is probably doing some work somewhere and isn't even here. She's probably actually getting some things done, and Helen Clark. And what we do is we listen to the stories, and we choose stories, and we curate them, and we help people rehearse. And also I should mention that this is AVA's 50th year. And the September Mudroom, the next Mudroom, is going to be the 10th anniversary of the Mudroom, which is hard to believe. If you remember back to the first Mudrooms, it doesn't seem to be that long ago. And so we're planning a very special 10th anniversary Mudroom for the next event. Also, we are going to be picking a story from the audience tonight. So as you're listening to the stories, if you become inspired to tell your own story, you can put your name into a basket, I think, somewhere, and we are going to just pick one out at random. So someone from this audience is going to get to tell a story. So keep that in mind. And when you're thinking, when you're watching the Storytellers and thinking, I could do that. I have a great story. This is your chance. So and we want to thank Pon for bringing the delicious food. And I got here early enough today to eat almost all of my food tonight, which was great. So our first storyteller tonight is Hannah Doubleday. And Hannah Doubleday has told stories at the Moth, and she has won a Moth Slam. I'm not going to read her entire bio because you have it, but I am going to point out that she is an above average mother, daughter, partner, and friend. But aren't we all? So, our first storyteller, Hannah Doubleday.
I'm a little short, so. Is that all right? Okay. When my son was a toddler, we made the decision to move from Maine back to Vermont because we wanted him to grow up with extended family all around him. And my former partner had this really amazing family. It was just huge. Her mom was one of 9 kids, and in our generation, there were 35 first cousins. And the really cool thing is that more than 20 of them all grew up in the same neighborhood. And it was really this amazing thing, and I had never experienced anything like that. So when we decided to have our own kids, I thought, I really want them. I want to give them that experience. And so we moved back to Vermont, and we built a house right next door to my in-laws. And I said they live in the same neighborhood. That's kind of loosely using that term because really we're way in the woods at the very top of this mountain. And to get there, you have to go a mile up a very steep, very narrow dirt road. And it's kind of an infamous road because all of these cousins were teenagers at one point, and they all learned to drive on the road. So I had heard just numerous stories of all the mishaps that different people got into driving on the road. And I was pretty intimidated, so much so that the whole time we lived in Maine, we would come back to visit, and I would not drive on that road. I was almost always the person that was doing the last leg of the trip, and we would get to the bottom, and even if my partner was asleep, I would stop and wake her up and say, you have to do this, I can't do this. Then we moved back, and I thought, okay, I can't be afraid to drive where I live, that's silly. And this is Vermont, and winter is very long, so I can't be stuck on a mountain with a toddler for a whole winter. So I need to figure this out. And really, winter was the issue. It wasn't, driving the rest of the year was not a huge issue. But luckily, we moved back in September. So I had a couple months to get used to it and get acclimated, and so I started sort of figuring out how am I going to tackle this. And my family thought I was ridiculous. To them, they were like, "You're going to end up in the ditch. Everybody ends up in the ditch. It's just a rite of passage. Don't worry about it." But I was really I'm a little competitive, so that was sort of like, okay, now this is a challenge. But the other piece is that this huge family, wonderful as they were and are, was still pretty foreign to me because I had been around for a decade, but I hadn't lived there. And being the in-law that visits periodically is very different than being the in-law that you see day in and day out. And so I was still kind of adjusting to that role. And because the road is so narrow, if you get stuck, nobody can get by you. And so my ego could not handle being the person that made all of these relatives unable to get to work or get home. And so that first winter arrived, and I was so focused. And I can say I really nailed it. Like, I did great. I figured out which driveways you could pull into if you met someone, and I figured out what neighbors were never going to stop no matter what. So if they're coming, you better get out of the way. And I got through that whole long winter without a single issue. And then, as the ground began to thaw, mud season arrived. And I'm from Vermont, so mud season, I was familiar with mud season, but I'd never lived on a dirt road. And I'd never even been on this road during mud season because the whole time we lived in Maine, we would always come home in March. There were all these family birthdays in March. So we'd always come home in March, and then we'd come for a long weekend in May. So I never had I'd never even seen the road in the middle of mud season. So as mud season unfolded, it really was like something I'd never seen before. It felt like every day these giant sinkholes would just appear in the road, and almost randomly, and it was this obstacle course to get from the bottom to the top without getting stuck. But the thing that sort of amazed me or surprised me was I hadn't ever heard anyone talk about mud season. And I mean, I had heard dozens of stories about winter, no stories about mud season. So my takeaway was, this is not anything to worry about. So I just went about my business. And I kind of did it was almost like a slalom to get around the puddles, and I did that, but I didn't think about it. I didn't obsess about it. And then one day, I was coming home from a play group with my son, and this one puddle, it was right before our house, and I think it had doubled in size since we left that morning. I mean, it was so huge. And I pulled right up to the edge of it and sort of trying to plan my attack. And I can see that you can't go, there's no way to go around it. And I can see that someone has sort of driven to one side, like half in the puddle and half on the side. And I don't want to do that because I'm so afraid of the ditch. It's so close to the edge, and I've just been conditioned, I don't want to end up in that ditch. So after a lot of thought, I decide that I am going to trust my Subaru, and I'm going to just go for it. And so I back up to get a pretty good start, and I just floor it, and I go right through the puddle, sort of, but not, because the minute my back tires hit it, I just stop, completely dead. So I'm now, my worst fear, I am stuck right in the middle of the road. Luckily, it is also the middle of the day, so I'm thinking I can still get out of this, because most people are at work, so I'm still thinking there is a way that I can get myself out of this, and no one has to even know. So luckily, my kiddo, who's been in the car the whole time, spent the first 2 years of his life constantly going from Vermont to Maine and Maine to Vermont. So he's totally fine in the car. It's not fazing him at all. So he stays in the car. I get out, try to sort of survey the situation, and I find this giant branch. And I think, this is traction. This is what I need. So I take the branch and I sort of shove it under the front of my tires. And that gives me the idea that I'm going to build a bridge. So I'm going to get all these branches. So I'm trucking these branches, and they're all these huge limbs, and I just stack them one right across the other, put them really tight against the wheels. And I mean, in my head, this is like a survivor moment. I'm just going to drive right out. It's going to be beautiful. So I get back in, and I put my foot on the accelerator, and as my tires turn, all of those sticks get sucked right into the mud, right next to my car. So I am clearly not getting out of this on my own. So I have my flip phone, but it doesn't work. So I have to go to my house, which luckily I've said I'm really close to my house. So I get my son out of the car. We walk up to my house to call the tow truck. And there is one tow truck driver that will come to our road. His name is George McCrae. And there's a couple cool things about George McCrae. One of them is that he is the guy that when semi-trucks get stuck in Smuggler's Notch, which happens because even though there are signs on the billboard on the highway that say your GPS is wrong, you won't fit, they go every year. At least a handful of trucks insist on going, and they get stuck, and George McCrae is who gets them out. He goes up there and he backs these giant semis down the mountain. So this is a skilled tow truck driver. The other thing about George McCrae is that before he owned a towing company, he was a school bus driver, and he drove all of those cousins. He drove all of them to school. So he's really familiar with our road. And he came up and was totally happy to pull me out. Took him almost no time. And as I got out and the rest of the season progressed, slowly that giant sinkhole dried up, and periodically you'd see these giant branches sticking out, it was kind of like pickup sticks. But as far as I know, I did not damage anybody's car with my ingenuity. And I will say that the toddler in the story turned 21 2 months ago. So quite a few years have passed, and I I will say over that time, I have gotten complacent, and I have ended up in the ditch, and I have been the person who couldn't get up the icy road, but I have never, ever had an issue during mud season again. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Hannah. Our next storyteller is Brandon Arvesen, and Brandon is actually a new colleague of mine at Colby Soar College, and I know him to be brilliant and very interesting and very funny. And because of that, I mean, this is just in meetings, I've seen this. I think I may have maybe conscripted him to come here and tell a story today. So I'm sorry, Brandon, but I'm really looking forward to this. And he also is new to the Upper Valley, so I'm not sure he's ever experienced a real mud season yet.
Thank you, Mike. In the summer of 1990, my mom dropped me off at a day camp outside a North Jersey high school called Summer Superstars. It was a gifted and talented program where we spent about half the day in classes doing advanced coursework and the rest of it going on field trips to like medieval times and the zoo and swimming and playing. And you can see just by what I can remember of it that I was probably not the best person to go to Summer Superstars. But nonetheless, I do remember one thing. I was about 9 years old. I had not really grown into my head, or certainly my ears. My sisters at the time referred to me as Howdy Doody, to just give you a solid image. And I went into Summer Superstars. I walked in, and every single adult that I met, so every counselor, every teacher, every director, I walked up and I said, "Hi, my name is Brandon Arvesen, and I'm adopted." And now that can be unsettling for an adult, right? For this marionette to sort of walk up and sort of spill out a fundamental truth of their core identity and who they are. And so a lot of them would pause and sort of not know what to say, to which me at 9 said, "Oh, they don't know what that means." So I would go and explain adoption as I understood it to these adults, which went something like there was a young woman and she got pregnant and she really couldn't take care of the baby, but my mom wanted another baby, and so my other sisters also adopted, so they got me, and it's like a whole thing. And they were like, okay. And so at the end of the day, when my mom came to pick me up, she was furious, right? Because the director pulled her aside and was like, "Is he okay?" Right? Like, is everything gonna be okay? And this was sort of the beginning in 1990, at 9 years old, of a series of mistakes or wrong turns, to use the theme of tonight, that I would make trying to figure out my relationship with what this really meant to be adopted, right? And the problem that was developing when I was 9 was that I thought a mistake had happened, right? That I must have been an accident. Right? How else could this proceed? And I would spend the majority of the 90s making choices at random to correct that mistake, right? So let's say you're now 10 or 11 and you're really into 21 Jump Street. Well, Johnny Depp could be your dad, right? And it turned out he was. Thank you. No, I'm kidding. So I would just choose an identity, right? And I would try it on. And I know that all adolescents do this in their own way, but I mean, I would choose an identity, right? I spent a summer pretending to be British in Pittsburgh. Not because I wanted to lie to people or not because I was just curious, because I thought if I could find the right identity, I'd feel it. I'd fix that mistake. And in a weird way, I thought she'd feel it too. And we'd sort of find each other and correct this mistake. Now, I made this mistake all through adolescence into college, right? I leaned into, let's give you some of the hits besides British. My parents moved us to a farm town, and I thought, don't lean into that. Start wearing plaid, a mohawk, and listen to 70s punk, because that might be who you're supposed to be, right? Or when I went to a camp in the middle of the Midwest, somebody heard my accent, and they're like, are you from New York? And I was like, of course I am. Right, and I had been to New York. I had been in the city to see the ballet with my parents, but that wasn't the part of the story that I was going to share. And I really didn't start to investigate this seriously until 2013. So now I'm in my 30s, and I've made a series of wrong turns on my own. I tried a marriage that didn't really work out in the right way, and I had, made some questionable decisions in every facet of my life. But it was Thanksgiving, and we had finished a meal, and my mom was really happy, and I sat her down, and I said, I need some information. And I told her what I was telling myself at the time, which is I'm 30-something now. I need some medical history, right? I need to know what cancers I have to look out for. I need to just know what's going on. So she said, okay, I'll look up what I have. I went home, and she emailed me, and it said, here's what I know. Good luck. I love you. Right? And she knew two things. My biological mother's name was Sarah. She had a middle name and a very sort of Scots-Irish last name that I'll choose not to share. And they had an address, Sarah's mom's house, in 1981 when I was born. So I did what anybody would do, right? I opened every tab, right? I got Facebook, I got Twitter, I got Instagram, I got Google Maps. And the craziest thing was that she didn't exist. There was nothing, like no footprint at all. The house was there, so that was nice, but what can you really do? You're like, okay, there it is. That's a house. I had no information to go on. And what was also weird is roughly around the same time, my passport expired. Sorry. And I had also, run it through the washing machine. And so the seam of it had opened up. And once you sort of break that seal, you can't just mail it off and, go through the process of renewing your passport. Instead, you have to reapply. So I called home, said, I got to reapply for this passport. Can I get a copy of my birth certificate, please? My mom said, I gave you that. And I said, I know I'm 30, but I'm not responsible enough to have my birth certificate. Please send me my birth certificate. And we went back and forth on this for a while until neither one of us had it. Okay, so I had to petition the state of New York where I was born. I said, hey, guys, I need a copy of my birth certificate. I filled out the forms, I sent them off. I didn't think anything about it. I got a letter, a week, maybe 2 weeks later, and it said, hey, bud, we can't prove you were born here. Sorry. Okay, so I went to the hospital that I was born. I was born in Beekman downtown, right in the middle of Manhattan. I said, surely they're going to have records of my birth. This is going to be great. Now, Beekman had actually closed, but it had been bought by another hospital. So I said, great. I called their records office, and they said, we keep records for 20 years, and you are in your 30s. Sorry. So I said, okay. I'm starting to really feel like there's something happening here. And then right when I was about to ask some really serious questions, out of nowhere, in a plain envelope, a birth certificate arrives. My last name is spelled wrong. No note, no, hey, we made a mistake, no clerical error, it's just there. And I move on with my life. And I don't think about it until about 2018, when I'm now in my MFA for creative nonfiction, and I'm writing a book about my father, who is a professional gambler. And I wanted to fact check something about my adoption, so I looked up the lawyer who had oversaw it, and I wanted to have some story. And all of these newspaper articles, I'm talking like New York Times, his name I'm happy to use, Stanley Michelman, the baby broker. And I'm like, wait a minute. Now it all makes sense. I've tried every identity. I've never felt anything. There is no Sarah. The mistake that was made wasn't, that this teenage girl had to give me up. The mistake was that my parents had been lying to me this whole time. And I started looking, and what he would do is he would represent the parents that wanted to adopt, and he would also secretly be representing somebody that had a baby to adopt. And then what he started to do is fill an apartment building that he owned with all these Eastern European women who were pregnant, and he's telling them, don't worry about it, I got all these families. He's telling the families, oh yeah, he's like a nice family from Philly, and he's arranging these. He got disbarred, he went to prison, and I'm like, I'm a stolen Russian baby. Which, by the way, when you're looking at your parents and you're about to really take them down, is horrible. But when you're becoming a nonfiction writer, you're like, I'm a stolen Russian baby. So I decided to take a DNA test, which I never really thought I wanted to do. I wait and I wait and I wait, and my wife and I, it arrives and we open. I needed her next to me. I'm like, I'm gonna record this, and I'm Scottish, and I'm Irish, and I'm Welsh, and I'm back to square one, right? There's nothing happening. But in my MFA, the one thing that I've really learned how to do is research and track people down and go through property records, and all of a sudden it dawns on me, I can find Sarah. I didn't know how to find Sarah before, but I can fix this mistake. I can find out what actually happened. I can answer all the questions. I can know who I am. And so I went back to that address, and I found a sibling that had lived in that house. And from that sibling, I found a Facebook page. And from that Facebook page, I found a Sarah with a different last name who had married way before social media and had never put her maiden name up. And I had found that there she was, the right age, the right location. This was a woman who adopted twins and raised them. I'm like, it's all there, and I'm gonna reach out and I'm gonna figure this out. And just as I'm really starting to get my head around, like, what is the email gonna be? My mom dies. And I'm like, it's not the time. I'm gonna wait. Because it feels disrespectful. My mom was always a little nervous, right? Because she adopted all of her kids. And that we would, I don't know, escape, right? And so, I don't know. And I said, okay, I'm gonna wait a little bit. But it was a public Facebook page, which is like the best for me, not for her, but you know. And it was nice because I'd see like her politics lined up with my politics, and I'd like I found she worked at this bar, and I was like, oh, maybe one day I'll just go. Like, I don't know how it's gonna go. And then the strangest thing happened is like once I'm starting to build it all back up, once I'm starting to be like, this is it. I need my answers. I need to know really where this all went wrong. She announced that her mom was passing away. And this was like at the tail end of COVID, and they were gonna live stream the funeral. And I'm weird, so I watched the funeral. And part of me really was just watching this happen, right? And her brother came up and started it, and the other brother that I had found through my research said something, and then her daughters like came up and sang a song, and then finally Sarah gets up and she walks into camera, and I can see her move, and I can hear her voice. And she just starts talking about her relationship with her mom. And selfishly, I'm like, this is it. She's gonna say something, right? She's gonna be like, my mom never wanted me to give that kid away, but look at me now, right? And I was gonna be like, ooh, it's gonna happen. Because your head does all kinds of crazy things when you're this close. And she didn't say anything about me. But what was really, really interesting was in that moment when I thought I had everything, there was no one who made mistakes in that room. There were no wrong turns, only the turns that got us to where we were. And I thought, if I'm gonna do the right turn, it's just to let Sarah grieve her mom, and for me to grieve mine, because that's what we had in common. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brandon. The final story in our first half, and there'll be a brief intermission where you can put your names into the hat to get chosen to tell a story in the second half, is Lianne Moccia, and she is a longtime member of the Mudroom committee. And one of the perks of the Mudroom committee is you get to offer to tell stories often, and she has told many stories at the Mudroom. And Lianne.
When I was 21 years old, my father flew from Logan Airport to Philadelphia, crossed the river to Camden, New Jersey, and bailed me out of jail. He said to me, "I can't believe you broke the law." And for the first time in my life, I said to him, "You break the law every day." I was an anti-war protester, and my father was a bookie. My father was smack dab in the middle of 10 children who survived infancy in the first-generation Italian Americans outside of Boston, and every single one of his brothers and sisters had black hair and dark eyes. My father had brown hair. We're not talking blonde, brown hair, lighter skinned, and a couple of freckles, and the family thought he looked Irish. So he was given the nickname Spudsy, which stayed with him his whole life. He was warm, friendly, gregarious, a jokester, connected to everybody in the neighborhood, in the community. He was a devout Catholic. He was a member of the Holy Name Society, for those of you who know what that is. He was a frequent communicant. He passed the basket at church on Sunday. And he had the respect and love and affection of everybody that I saw him interact with. I had 2 brothers. I was the oldest of 3, and my 2 brothers played the Little League, and my father was always at the McMacken Field cheering them on. Well, I'm old, before Title IX, no athletics for me, but I did take piano lessons. And my father came dutifully to my annual piano recital and sat with my mom. And while all the kids were plinking and planking through the endless fur-elises and pieces, my father had in his pocket a tiny transistor radio about the size of an iPhone, plastic with round dials, and I think it had maybe one of the first earpieces I ever saw. He had it in his ear, and the wire went down into his pocket, and he was listening to the Red Sox. And he was smiling and clapping at the right moment, and when it was my turn, my mother gave him the little elbow, and he unhooked the earpiece, listened to me, and enthusiastically clapped for me, and then put the earpiece back in. So I think I was probably in grammar school, maybe 1st or 2nd grade, when we had to bring home papers for our parents to fill out. This is before computers, so everything was on a piece of paper. And I was practicing my Reinhardt penmanship, and I said, "Can I fill out the paper, Mom and Dad?" And they said, "Okay." And I sat at the kitchen table, and Father's name, his real name was Anthony Moccia, my mother's name, our address, phone number, Atlantic 40421. And then it said occupation. And there was a moment of silence between my parents and some tension or something. I didn't know what, and I'm waiting. And they said, self-employed. So I had to, they spelled it out for me, hyphen self-employed. I didn't know what that meant, but I brought the paper to school. And I would say over the next year or 2, I got more of a feeling that there was some tension between my parents about my father's work. Now, I lived in a neighborhood where Vinnie Martelli was a postman, Eddie Tiernan was a janitor at a local hospital, the Morgans owned a bar. I thought that was a little seedy. And I didn't know what my father did, but he left every day in the one car that we had. All the men left in the one car. All the women stayed home and did the housework. And work wasn't that big a deal. People didn't talk about, where do you work? So I didn't really know what that meant. But I heard the word bookie at some point, and I had no idea what that was. But I knew it wasn't okay. And I was devout little Catholic girl. And I was afraid that my father was committing a sin. And so what this means in Catholicism is that our family, I and my brothers and my mother, would be enjoying the beatific vision for all eternity, and my father would be in hell. And I was terrified for him. And I prayed all the time, that he would, I didn't know what to pray for, but I was praying for him. So the sin part was really big for me. The sin part started to switch over to fear because I was afraid maybe when I found out it was illegal that he was going to be arrested. So I'm also getting a little bit big for my britches. When you get older, you get smart, and your parents get stupid. And I'm feeling like I sort of know what he should do, but what can I do? And I realized at some point in there, my dad bought in with another person in the community part ownership of a small store in town. So on the sheet that came home for occupation, it now said shop owner. But my father didn't work there. So I knew that wasn't really where he worked. I just knew that's what we put on the piece of paper. moving along, I now go to high school, and I left the community I lived in, which was very familiar to me, and I went to high school a few towns away with people who were different than me, i.e. not Italian. And I started to feel like a little ashamed. What if somebody asked me what my dad did? Well, at this point, he had been operating out of a pool room. It could have been a barber shop, could have been a fruit stand, could have been a newsstand, could have been anything, but it was a pool room. You know, capital T rhymes with P, stands for pool, literally. And they decided to tear the pool room down. There's two little, you know, sort of the green light, the green felt table, and they built a billiard lounge, my father and a business partner, with 24 tables. This was going to be family entertainment like a bowling alley. I don't think that ever really took off, but that was the idea. And it was going to be, and my father started to be there every day, and he was sort of running this business. So I guess he was going legit. I, on the other hand, was starting to go illegit. I was in high school and then in college, and I learned about the civil rights movement, and I was enthused, and then about the war in Vietnam. And that's how I found myself when I was 21 years old in Camden, New Jersey, with a ragtag bunch of nuns, priests, ex-nuns, ex-priest, a bona fide member of the Catholic left. I was in the background a lot, but on the night of August 21st, 1971, I was in the foreground and caught red-handed inside the federal building in Camden, New Jersey, where we had planned to enter and destroy draft records. So again, this was before the days of computers. So every man who had a draft file had one paper copy. And if you could actually destroy it, it wasn't just a symbolic action, it was effective. So we had chosen Camden because it was one of the poorest cities in the United States. And on the night of August 21st, I was arrested with, "Put up your hands, FBI, you're under arrest." Guns, blaring lights, get up against the wall, spread your legs. 28 of us were arrested. And there was one person who didn't get arrested that night, which we quickly figured out was the informer. So this man, and this is a story I'll tell another time, joined the group for one meeting, and then his civic duty informed him to go to the FBI, and he told them what we were planning, and they said, "Great, stay in the group, help them do whatever they need to do, give them any tools they need." He was so helpful. He even one time suggested that we have a gun. We should have smelled a rat. This was a nonviolent, you know, the Catholic left. We didn't want to hurt a fly. So anyway, he had informed on us, and at that point, J. Edgar Hoover was really wanting to, quote, break the back of the Catholic left, because there had been many, many draft board actions, and he said, "This is it, I'm going to get them now." So he told this guy, "Stay with the group." He stayed with the group, he ratted on us, and that was how I found myself in jail. So my father came to pick me up, brought me back to Boston. It was a long, quiet plane ride back home. We got back to my home, my little neighborhood, and all of our family and friends came bearing little cardboard boxes tied with red and white string, filled with Italian pastries and cookies, hugging my mother and father, crying with my mother and father. Oh, where did she go wrong? She was such a good student, and she was such a good girl. What happened? We're so sorry. It was like someone had died. And my picture was on the front page of the Boston Globe. A thing I had feared about my own father. It was big on the front page, and an awful picture, actually. And I know that my father was both ashamed and afraid of what I did, which is what I felt about what he did. We went to trial in several months after that in Camden, New Jersey. And we put the Vietnam War on trial. We had a judge who, for some reason, let us bring all kinds of evidence into the courtroom. We defended ourselves. We had all kinds of people coming and talking, and the jury acquitted all 28 people of all counts. My father didn't get to see this vindication. My father died suddenly and was buried 2 days before the trial started. And at his funeral, at the Bonfiglio funeral home, for 2 days and 2 nights, literally several hundred people came through the line, and person after person, especially a lot of young men, said, "Your father is the kindest person I ever met. He gave me a job, he helped me out, he found me a place to live." I mean, I had no idea the respect that my father held in the community. So I went to trial, we got vindicated, and I would say that the American public cast its own judgment on the Vietnam War in the intervening years. The lives lost, the American service people, the Vietnamese people. And I think that the results of the trial and the results of what the public understood about Vietnam, my father never got to have that understanding about what I did. But I have had 50 years to think about what he did. Actually, last month I went back to Camden, to Rutgers, where there was a day-long symposium celebrating and investigating and talking about the trial of the Camden 28 and the legal precedents it set, its place in the history of the anti-war movement. It was really a beautiful day, and 14 of us, 9 of us were able to go back and be there for this event. So my father never saw that, but I got to think about what did he do? And what I've come to think about is, my dad didn't have a white shirt and tie and a briefcase. I didn't actually know any men in my neighborhood who had a briefcase or who went to work with a white suit and jacket tie on. These were working class people. And I've come to actually think a little bit that my father was providing a community service to people who were looking to better their lives, take a risk, make it big, make a hit, maybe get a leg up, in the American dream. Had my father had a white shirt and tie and a briefcase, he could have been a stockbroker, and that's what stockbrokers do. And I've come to understand that it's a service for a different class of people. So when I think about wrong turns, and when I think about the way in which my father was afraid for me and ashamed of me, and the way in which I was afraid of my father and ashamed of my father, it's taken me a long time to realize, he was a good person, and he was doing something that actually people valued greatly in the community, believe me. So I think I was acquitted, and I think I have acquitted my father, and I think that wrong turns, it's only after you've gone down the road that you can look back and say, who paved that road? Who made the rules about, how that road goes? Everything my father did is legal now, Scratch tickets, charity casinos that we have in Lebanon. I mean, there's nothing about that except it's controlled by somebody else now. So who made the rules? Who set the road? Who decided which turns were right and wrong? And I feel like you don't really know that until you look back and see where you went. Thank you.
Well, that was the first half of our program. We're going to have about a 15-minute intermission, and during intermission, I'm asked to mention that the Members Gallery is open, and it's a great place to buy gifts or buy some artwork for yourself. And also, did I mention that you should put your name into the basket to get chosen to tell a story? And there is also a raffle. So when you're putting your name into the basket to get chosen, you'll have to also take a ticket stub and put that into a different basket, not the basket that you're going to put your name into to get chosen to tell a story. So we'll see you back here in about 15 minutes.
But I'm really glad to be here. You know how much I love the Mudroom. First, we're going to pick the storyteller, right? Yes. Okay, we're going to pick the storyteller from the audience. Lianne, do you want to come up and... And the storyteller will be... Laura Williams. Laura? Did she run out? Yay!
Of course, the only thing about the storyteller from the audience, it's supposed to be limited to like a 5-minute story. So at 5 minutes, we'll give you a warning, and then if you keep going,
We're going to squirt you with a squirt gun.
At 20 minutes, we'll pull you off.
That's right.
No.
Okay, so welcome, Laura.
Thank you.
All right.
Sorry. Whatever. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, this is a very powerful mic.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I had learned as a Christian that it says that God's people hear his voice and they don't follow another. And I thought, well, I'm going to try to practice hearing God's voice. And I want to do it in a safe way that, like, if I say, God, do I go home this way or this way? Either way, I get home. So I can't go wrong, but anyway, one day I picked up my kids from the small school that they went to, and I said, God, which way do you want me to go home? And I felt like he said, go straight. But I counted, and there was like 13 stoplights that way, and one of them back then, you could just get to that stoplight, the first one, and it would turn green just long enough for one car to go through. So, I mean, I knew I was at least missing one. I had one red light or a bunch more. So I decided I'd take the other route that went across this bridge and went up over railroad tracks. I'd probably done it hundreds and hundreds of times, and it would just catch the interstate and bypass all those lights. Well, this was the first time when I decided that I'd go across and take my route that I encountered the train. I had never encountered the train before, but it wasn't just that the train was going by. This is where the train would go by or would stop and then back up and put on cars. So the train is going forward and backwards and forward and backwards. And I told my kids, and they're laughing in the back, and they're going, Mom, why don't you just turn around? And I said, you know what? This time I'm going to listen to God, and I'm not moving until I hear and know which way to go. So I waited for a minute because I didn't know if, the train would move and I could go straight, but I felt like he said turn around. So I turn around, I go across the bridge, I'm driving down the road parallel. I still see that train going back and forth, back and forth. But I went through 13 green lights. And God said to me afterwards, if I ask you to do something, don't look at the stoplights. So.
Thank you very much. So our first storyteller in this half is Julie Puttgen. Am I pronouncing that right, Julie? She has a great bio, but what I'm most interested in is it says she's a former Buddhist nun. So that story might be a story for a mudroom at some point. So welcome, Julie.
Okay, so I'm really tall. All right. So with all this talk of wrong turns, I'm actually going to do a little therapist trick and invite everybody to orient. Does anyone know what that means? It's like, how do you know where you are? And essentially, there are big parts of our nervous system that are concerned at all times with, where am I? So simple orienting exercise looks like this. You're going to look all the way behind you in one direction and just notice anything you notice in that direction that's interesting to you. Great. And then you're going to come around and you're going to look all the way behind you in another direction. And same thing, you're just like, cool, I've never looked in this direction before because I've been looking at the storytellers. And this is not just me trying to get you to not look at me. So to complete the orienting, you're also going to look down. And if you're feeling like extra involved with this, you might want to check under your chair for scorpions or snakes or anything else that your system just kind of wants to know about. And then you're going to complete this by looking above you. So look above. Oh, wow, look at this whole light grid, smoke alarms, there's all this stuff. So now you've oriented. And a lot of times if you're feeling a little freaked out and you don't mind looking weird, this is a very helpful thing to do. Because you're essentially giving these like primordial positioning systems in your nervous system a chance to just suss it all out and be like, wow, that lady has a great sweater, or like, wow, that guy's haircut is really working for him. And you've oriented, and now you know where you are, and you're connected, and you're safe. So let me tell you a line story, okay? So a line story is, you wake up in the morning, and you gather your stuff, and you go west. And you do that day after day. You wake up, you gather your stuff, you walk west. That's a line. And you might do that, for example, maybe some of you have heard of the Camino de Santiago in Spain. It's a pilgrimage road. You wake up, you go west. That's a line story. You could do that in the morning. You wake up, you get in your car, you go where you work, you come back. That's a line story. It's hard to take wrong turns in a line story because you kind of know where west is thanks to the sun, or you hopefully know where work is and where home is, and you go back and forth. So that's a line story, okay? So let me tell you a circle story. So a circle story is a little different because it has built into it that you're going around something. So a couple years after I walked on the Camino de Santiago when I was 19, I was fascinated with pilgrimage and starting to be really interested in Buddhism, a fateful interest as it turned out. And I found out about this pilgrimage in Japan that was basically, there's this little island and it looks kind of like a miniature version of Australia. And the pilgrimage is you walk all the way around it. The island is called Shikoku Island. And so a circle story is you wake up and you pack up your stuff and you go a little bit further clockwise around this island. That's a circle story. And sometimes things are well marked and you're like, cool, I know where the next temple is. I know where temple number 65 is because there's this handy sign. And even though I don't read any Japanese, they've thoughtfully put it in Roman characters as well. So I'm cool. And sometimes you don't really know, but you might ask a little kid with his dog and a bicycle, and that little kid might actually become conscripted to be your personal guide to temple number 68 for the afternoon, and then you get there and you wake up and that's your circle story. So your circle story, you know that wherever you started, you're gonna wind up right back there at the end. And the thing that's interesting about a circle pilgrimage is that I was there one time already seemed like a lot. At the time of my interview for the grant that gave me the money to go do the pilgrimage, I had a really messed up knee, and so I actually parked my crutches outside the room where the interview was happening because I didn't think I'd be taken seriously as a walking pilgrim on crutches. So I thought one time was great, but there were lots and lots and lots of other pilgrims in their 80s and their 90s, these incredible, Japanese elders who had done this, and they had these beautiful, flashy pieces of damask that had on them the number of times that they had done this pilgrimage. And so sometimes, someone would hand you this piece of damask paper and it said, their name and then like 86 times, wow, and then or somebody else even tinier and older with an even flashier piece of damask paper, 120 times. And you're like, double wow, how did anyone do that in a lifetime and do anything else? Because it's a small version of Australia, but it's still a sizable island. So a circle story looks like that. So line story, circle story. Let me tell you a labyrinth story. A labyrinth story, it's very hard to tell what is actually going on because you enter and you go around and then you go down and you go back. Did I just make a wrong turn? And you go around And did I just make a wrong turn? You can't tell. And then you shoot across, and then you can kind of see where you were before, but you're on the other side and you still don't know. So a labyrinth story is a story that might be composed entirely of wrong turns. That's the way it can feel sometimes. Once upon a time, I lived a labyrinth story. So I had been living in a monastery outside of London, and the time came when I requested ordination as a novice nun. And the nun said, well, maybe. They said, you need to go see the nuns in the forest, and if they think it might be okay, then maybe it's okay. But you have to go see the nuns in the forest. So this was 1994. The smartphone did not exist for the young people in the audience. And basically what I had was the name of a train station and a photocopied piece of paper with some vague directions. So one fine morning, I got up and I put on my finest pair of men's pajamas and some sort of protection for the rain. I had been living as a kind of on-the-road Dharma bum for months, and so my wardrobe was a bit eclectic, though I did favor pajamas. And I got myself to the train station nearest to the monastery, and I went to the right station, and I got off the train, and I walked, and I left the station, and I walked, and I left the high street of the little town, and I walked, and I found something that sounded like the path on my Xerox piece of paper, and I left that path, and soon enough, I was totally lost. I was in the hollow way, which was where the carts and animals and people had gone for, centuries from market town to market town. And then that sort of coughed me up into a maze or a labyrinth of little tiny lanes that were so narrow and between such high hedges that there was barely room for one car. There was definitely not room for one car and one very lost Buddhist, and where things became absolutely impossible was one car in each direction and a lost Buddhist. So I was walking, and I remember at one point I came to a crossroads. And let's say there were 5 choices, and they were each marked very carefully. There was this very beautiful, ornate, cast iron sign with white lettering on black, and each of these 5 directions were indicated with a name that meant absolutely nothing to me, and a distance that meant equally absolutely nothing to me. So I wandered, and I wandered, and I wandered. And finally, just as night was going to fall, I found myself in a dark hollow, and I could just hear the sound of a hatchet splitting kindling. And when I approached, I saw that who was splitting kindling was a bald Buddhist nun, and I asked, could this be the nun's cottage? And she said, yes, of course it was. So in an entire day of what felt like wrong turns and right turns, maybe, I started to become familiar with something that has never left me since then, which is that sometimes I am on my way to some place so important or so transformative in my life that it simply does not want to be found easily. It does not want to be my line story. It does not want to be my circle story. Now, in my practice as a therapist, when I have a first session with a client and they're very, very late and they tell me a story like, I was walking and my phone told me it would take 20 minutes, but it was 50 minutes, and then the place where the bridge was supposed to be, there was no bridge, I think, oh, welcome to the labyrinth. Or they will say, I for some reason parked my car at the building 2 blocks away from yours, and then I just didn't know where to find you. I think, oh, maybe now I'm the nun in the labyrinth with a hatchet. Let's be really careful here. I wonder what quest has brought this person to this place and time right now. So in a world of a lot of value for line stories are awesome, right? Like you can be a big success. Like I started at the beginning of the line, I got to the end of the line, woo, right? So that's valued. There's some value maybe sometimes to the circle story, like I came full circle and I understood, this. I think the labyrinth story, where you're just lost as anything and wandering around and you don't even know the direction that you should be going in, those are the stories that increasingly are interesting to me as here we are. How do we orient to where we are? How do we know what we're looking for?
Thank you, Julie. Our next storyteller is David Szelowski. David, did I do that right? Okay, all right. David spent 24 years in the Marine Corps, and he has an interesting tale to tell. So welcome, David.
So my story is called A Funny Thing Happened to Me on the Way to Sarajevo. Back in Sorry? Oh, sorry. I'm used to yelling, not microphone. Back in the mid-1990s, I was part of the NATO mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I was the Director of Plans and Policy for Logistics. I was also the Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff for Logistics, which meant that if you got fed in one of the 23 countries, the plan came from me. We did the planning for all the bridges, the roads, and demining. So I was a very popular guy, too popular as far as I was concerned. I did a lot of traveling, and generally I traveled with a driver who was also my bodyguard and who happened to have the cell phone. Well, on this one trip, I was in Krakow, Poland, and I decided, I had 24 hours that I wasn't needed anywhere. I am going to take a train trip. And I'm going to take a train trip from Krakow to Zagreb, pick up my helicopter, and go to Sarajevo, and life is going to be fine. And nobody is going to be able to bother me for 24 hours. So I pick up my tickets there at the train station, and my Russian and German helped me enough that I think I got the right tickets, and it's wonderful on the European train. I'm sitting there, I'm packing my pipe, I'm reading my book, I'm watching the scenery go by, and it's idyllic. And in the morning, we're going down across the plains of Hungary, and it's wintertime, and there's snow, and it's just gorgeous. We pull into Budapest, wait 15 minutes, I consult my watch. Yeah, it's going to be 4 more hours of freedom before I have to get back to it. Train pulls off. Well, 90 minutes later, the train stops. And we're all hustled off the train, and I couldn't quite understand it. And I'm looking around, and we're in an agricultural area, and this is literally the end of the line. And one little clue about Hungary, by the way, and Hungarians, they speak Hungarian. Which is a very unique language. It's no roots in German, no roots in Russian, and nothing in English at all. So I finally get the station manager, and through hand and arm signals, looking at maps, I finally get the ticket that I need to get to Zagreb. This is great. Life is fine. And the guy even points me to the train I need to get to. Very polite, very happy. I'm on the train, breaking out my book, got my pipe. Life is fine. We pull into Budapest, wait 15 minutes, and then it goes off again. This time, I'm being more aware of where I am and where I'm going. Looking at the sun, knowing what time it is, we're going north by northwest. That's perfect. By the way, it reminds me of a title of something, but north by northwest, this is good. We're going to where I need to go to. Starting to get, dark, and I'm looking out there, and there is no lights out there. No cars, and there's farms with no lights. It's eerie type of thing. So finally got dark, and the conductor comes by and starts taking tickets. Comes to mind, there's a problem. So she indicates I need to collect my toys and come with me. to the penalty box, I'm sure of it. I'm looking out there, and hopefully they're not going to throw me off the train, because there's nothing out there except a meter of snow. And again, through maps and pointing and all this, I discovered I was 150 kilometers short on my ticket. And so I had to pay 1,200 florentines. Well, Eastern Europe in those days, the international currency was Deutschmarks, and so I gave her 20 and said, you can keep the change. Well, she didn't. She actually gave me change. And then indicated to me that I was going to be let off at the Croatian border, which I thought was a little odd, but she was going to help me with that. So as the train goes along, and you clickety-clack, clickety-clack, and then it starts slowing down, and I'm looking out there, and there's still nothing. There's no villages. There's no lights. Just snow and another track. And I don't know where I'm at, and nobody else knows where I'm at, so that's kind of concerning. So finally, the train comes to a stop, and here comes this building, and it's bifurcated in two parts. One is the police station, and one is something else. And she indicates that this is where I need to get off and go to something else. Cross the tracks, cross the snow, and it's a door with a naked light bulb on top of it, kind of odd, and so I open it up, and I went into a time warp. I am now 1950 Stalinist era. There's no windows in this place. It's just particle board. And in one corner, there's this black and white TV, and it's kind of flickering, and it's got some sort of agricultural thing going on here. And I'm looking at the tables with the people, and they don't look like they're waiting for a train. Okay, so I've been in weird places, but so I buy a beer. I find a place where I can saddle up to the wall, stoke my pipe, pretend to read my book as I'm watching people here, and just waiting that 20 minutes for the next train. Well, finally, this one huge Hungarian comes up to me. This guy was 6'40". His hands were just massive. So obviously one of the farmers. And very politely, and in Hungarian, I assume it's a Hungarian, he asked me for some of my pipe tobacco, which I thought was a little odd because I didn't see anybody smoking a pipe except me. But, fine, here, guy, take as much as you want. He very gently takes some, rolls himself a cigarette, lights up, smiles, thanks me very, I think he said thank you very much, and went back to his mates. I'm going, whew, okay, time's up, I need to get my train. Finally slide out there, and here is the train to Zagreb, and there's the Croatian police, probably the only time I've actually wanted to see the Croatian police. But they're speaking a language at least I can understand. It's Serbo-Croatian. Oh my gosh, I can communicate. I get on the train and I can read the signs. I can even read the memo. Oh, this is great. I'm sitting there. But for the next 2 hours, what occupied my thoughts was how I was going to tell the senior staff that the reason why I was 12 hours late was because I missed my train in Budapest. Not once, but twice. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our last storyteller for the evening is Chet Clem. And Chet lives here in Norwich with his wife, Julie, his twins, Gus and Winnie, and a dog named Willie Nelson. Chet? Oh, there you are. Okay.
So my dad and I are driving on this windy, narrow, two-lane road through an impossibly narrow valley in the Massanutten mountain range in Western Virginia. And it has been pouring rain all morning, the way that makes you wish your windshield wipers had another gear on them. And the fog has sunk down and stuck in the valley. So as we're driving, it's like being on an airplane when you look out the window and you're going through the big puffy clouds, just catching glimpses as you go. But it's houses that we're passing and other cars coming at us. And I'm not usually someone who complains about rain, But the problem is we desperately need to roll the windows down in the truck, because in the back seat with us is my dog, Willie Nelson. And last night at the motel, he ate something unidentifiable from a trash can. And his gastric distress is causing some distress for us in the front seat. And we're hopelessly lost, but somewhere in this valley is where my 9th great-grandfather lived as the first Clem in America. And I can feel that we're close. I have goosebumps. And not just because we have the AC going at full blast to create a cold front to keep that smell in the back seat if we can. And we realize this is probably as close as we're gonna get. And it's been a great trip, it's been a lot of fun. But we have no idea where we are, and the fog's just making things a little bit more complicated. Were we supposed to turn at that big blue barn back there? Have we gone far enough? Have we gone too far? Where the hell are we? How did we get here? And this story actually starts a few months earlier, when I found out that my wife was pregnant with twins. And that meant not one, but 2 names that we had to figure out to give these kids. So I start, now's the time you start researching your family history. And I have all the tools you need for modern genealogical research. I have the Ancestry.com app on my phone, and I have a crippling case of insomnia. And so I am in it. I'm playing the Ancestry.com app like my friends play fantasy sports. I am building my tree with long-lost relatives. I am emailing strangers, 80-year-olds in Illinois, exchanging information, talking about which graveyards we've been to, normal things that one does. And so one night at an unreasonable hour late in the evening, I call my dad, and immediately when he answers, I blurt out, "Dad, I have something to tell you." It's a weird thing to get after midnight. And I go, "Dad, we're German." And that was a surprise to him, not just because that information clearly could have waited until the next morning, but because we thought we were British. Somewhere along the line, the story had been that Clem was shortened from Clement, or maybe I just thought, maybe I wanted to be a long-lost cousin of Roger Clemens, my boyhood hero, the pitcher on the Red Sox. But no, turns out we're from the Clems with a K and 2 M's on the end. I later pieced together that one of the reasons why we had lost track of the German heritage was my great-uncle Chester, who I'm named after. I never got to meet him. He died before I was born, but Chester was a B-17 bomber in the war, flying over his ancestral homeland, bombing his ancestors, part of a proud Clem family tradition of being anti-fascists. And he got shot down by a German fighter pilot and spent 2 years in a German POW camp. That would tend to give anyone an opinion on the Germans. And so you can start to understand why we had lost track of that. And all I knew growing up was that my parents and grandparents were from Texas. But despite what Texans will tell you, Texan is not a nationality. And in the research, I learned a really important and crucial thing. A couple things, actually. I learned that we had fled Germany for religious freedom, that we had never owned slaves, and that I think it was my 5th great-grandfather fought for the North in the Civil War against some of his own family. That is like hitting the trifecta of white guilt relief. Now, those of you who have seen the Ancestry.com commercials on TV, you've seen the stories about people discovering that they're long-lost European royalty, or they're a distant relative of Genghis Khan or some other famous figure. Not the Clems. I found out that one of the first Clems in America, some distant cousin, went by the nickname Biscuit. And that'll tell you two things. One, if your nickname shows up on the census, you're pretty committed to the nickname. And two, us Clems have never been a skinny people. And that fact sends my imagination into overdrive. Can you imagine that 18th century occurrence? A letter has come from the New World from Cousin Biscuit. All right, kids, say goodbye to everyone and everything you know. Everybody on the boat, we're gonna go live with Biscuit. And so when we set off on this road trip, I had called my dad and I said, Dad, let's drive from New England to Texas. We'll detour through Virginia. We'll find where we're from. And he said, that's great, very enthusiastic, which was good because I had not posed it as a question. And so we were gonna have this was the spring of 2016, we were gonna have this Steinbeckian Travels with Charlie experience where we would travel the nation in an election year and figure out who we were, and one last hurrah as a father and son bonding experience before I became a dad and he got the promotion to grandfather. And so my very pregnant and very understanding wife sends us off on our way with our dog. And she looks me in the eye and she says, Chet, I have two rules. Come back safe, and we're not naming either child Biscuit. So here we are back in this valley that my ancestors found by boat and by horse-drawn wagon and the stars. We have a truck with GPS, a farty dog in the back. I have an Ancestry.com app that can't find an internet signal, and we are horribly, totally lost. But it's been a great trip. We found the valley. This is it. It's enough. We can get back on the road and head home. So the next driveway we see, in a break in the fog, we pull in to turn around and head back to the main road. And as my dad is doing a three-point turn, we look up and we see on the porch, there's two gentlemen and a dog. And they're all three staring at us with a look that says they don't appreciate out-of-state plates in their driveway. And at that moment, Willie, who had to this point shown at best a modest interest in this whole endeavor, wakes from his gassy slumber, acknowledges that they too have a dog that he must at least bark at. And as he jumps up to bark, his paw hits the button on the window, and Willie jumps out the window of the now rapidly moving vehicle trying to flee this driveway. And the dog sticks the landing, runs over and plays with their dog, and these two gentlemen come down off the porch, and they had been side-eyeing us a second ago. You can't not laugh when you see that go down. And so they come up and they say, what are y'all looking for? And I started to explain that we're on this road trip, and anyway, it turns out we're cousins. They've got a different last name, but we have the same seventh great-grandfather, Dieter Clem. Wife chimes in later that night, strike two, also not a name we're gonna consider. And it turns out they're telling us all these unbelievable stories. That big blue barn that we had driven past was built by my fifth great-grandfather, Michael. Turns out the Clems have always been builders. It turns out there's Clems all over the place. It's the Valley of the Clems. It also turns out that in that narrow valley, the family tree doesn't branch super wide. Or as my newly found cousin tells us, well, back then, who you married sort of depended on how far you were willing to walk to find a wife. And so 15 minutes later, they've told us where to go, and we're following a total stranger on her four-wheeler through her field, through knee-high, soaking wet grass. And as we start walking up the hill, and the sun is trying to break through the clouds, and the fog is slowly melting away, and we crest this hill, and we look down this stunning valley that's becoming clear, and Willie promptly vomits. And then we look at him, and we look at this stranger, and she kind of shrugs, and we keep going, and we go on to the next hill, and we see, well, it's a stone wall, and all I knew from this old deed was, there's a stone wall, and then there's a tree at the corner. Well, I think it was safe to assume that the tree wasn't there 280-something years later. But she leads us along, and all of a sudden we realize that we're standing in the crumbling stone foundation of the first Clem family homestead in America, where 280 some odd years ago, Johann David Clem had landed and decided would be home. Or knowing the Clem's family luck on road trips, and knowing from my research that he had been traveling with his wife, his 5 kids, and his mother-in-law in a wagon, perhaps being pulled by a farty horse, that he had decided, this may not be where we were looking for, but it's close enough. And so I never found names for my kids in Virginia. My son Gus is named for the Roald Dahl and Walt Disney character Gremlin Gus, known for positive mischief. That was the mission I wanted for him in life. And Gremlin Gus was the nose art on my Uncle Chester's bomber. And my daughter's name is Winnie. And my wife and I, well, we named her for a karaoke bar in New York. That's a story for another time. But what we did find, my dad and I, is we found our kin, and we found where we came from. And we found that sometimes a wrong turn will lead you to where you're supposed to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's a wrap for this mudroom, but I'd like to talk to you about September's mudroom. It is our 10th anniversary, and we really, really, really want you to submit stories about the big event. And a big event doesn't have to be an anniversary or the birth or a marriage. It could be, I don't know, your first kiss, or, it could be anything. Whatever was a big event to you. Please submit stories, and we guarantee it's going to be a really great mudroom. So we will see you in September. Thank you very, very much.